Hey homies, and welcome to The Truth Hurts with me, Tony Quinn, where we talk addiction, recovery, mental health, and everything in between. So before I begin, I just want to say thank you to each and every one of you who tuned into the last video I posted. I have not posted to YouTube for 2 years, and I've been focusing on TikTok and Instagram, and I genuinely did not expect anyone to view that video. So thank you to all of you who took the time to do that. Thank you. Getting a bit emotional. I also put something forward in my Instagram stories and asked you guys what kind of topics you would like me to cover here. And one of them really stood out for me. All of them stood out for me, but one of them stood out for me the most because it's something I'm currently dealing with and working through. And I just want to show you. Here it is. I'm not making this up. It says, how to forgive yourself for all the bad things you did and people you hurt while you were using. And I think it's such an interesting topic. Accountability and self-forgiveness are such interesting topics because a lot of people don't want to tackle it or talk about it. I know that when I hear people talk about those topics, I get instantly uncomfortable. So we're going to get uncomfortable together. I'm sorry in advance. But what I want to start with is that for the longest time, I thought self-awareness meant I had to be self-critical. And I've been sober 12 years, probably up until recently, all I did was be incredibly critical on myself. I would never treat another human being or speak to another human being in recovery the way I speak about myself. And that's something I've had to work on, something I have actually been called out on before. For example, reading a journal entry from when I was in active addiction and mocking my past self and how badly it's written. Yes, I can look at it from the angle of I'm actually a writer. That's what I do for a living. And I'm able to see what I didn't like in that writing, but it really wasn't bad. I was expressing my emotions while in active addiction. It doesn't make the writing bad just because I was addicted, you know? And I would never say that to another human being. So why am I saying it to myself? There's still elements of my past that I obviously need to forgive and be kinder about. But before we get to that, I think it's best to start off with my journey of accountability and self-awareness when I became a bit toxic to myself, and how to turn that around and how to forgive myself. Okay, it's going to be a tough one. Let's go. I said let's go. I'm so sorry. So my journey with accountability actually begins in my last rehab. And I've told this story before. It's the story I tell when people say, what was your big change? What made you want to change? And I'll tell it again, and I'm sorry if you've heard it before. But I was sitting in group therapy. We were all sitting in a circle, as you do, and I was asked my story. I was asked to speak about my past, and I started sharing about my trauma, which is something I did in all my rehabs. I would hone in on specific topics and kind of tell it like this tale and make myself very emotional at the right parts, pull back at the right parts. And I would make sure everyone else was feeling the emotions I was feeling. It was this form of manipulation that I used. Pour me a drink. And I'm telling the story about how my cousin passed away. And I wanted my counselor to react the same way all my other counselors had, with compassion, with empathy, with emotion. But instead, she was just like looking at me in my soul. And she looked me dead in the eye and she said, how does it feel having disrespected the memory of your dead cousin and used her death to traumatize yourself and your family even further? Just let that sit with you for a while, because I wanted to get up and I wanted to throw hands, bro. I was ready to throw hands, but this woman who I've interviewed on this channel before could have literally killed me. And I had to sit with it. I had to sit with it. And I realized in that moment she was 100% right. I was using my trauma as an excuse to traumatize. And in that moment, my past and what I had done in active addiction slowly washed over me. And I started to realize that many times throughout my active addiction, I had gone from abused to abuser, victim to victimizer. And I really needed to sit with that. And it made me incredibly uncomfortable. And it made me incredibly sad. And that's when my journey to healing really began. It was a sense of self-awareness I hadn't felt in a really long time. And I was sober while feeling those emotions. It was uncomfortable. It was awful, but it made me see truth. And I think one of the reasons it resonated with me was because my counselor turned out to be a recovering addict. And you can't bullshit a bullshitter. Now, I'm not saying all recovering addicts should be counselors. This one should have been a counselor because she said it in a way that was strong, and harsh, but also kind, which made me have to sit with it, which made me have to think about it. And I did. And that's when my journey began. And it was incredibly overwhelming. So what I'm going to discuss now is the process of taking accountability for the shitty things I did and the people I hurt in active addiction, and how I got to the point of being able to forgive myself, letting go of being self-critical about everything, and finally getting to the point where I am today. And I am still learning. I am not perfect at this. I am learning with you. So let's start with what happened when I realized, shit, I need to actually speak about all the shitty things I did, see my part in all the shitty things I did, acknowledge the things that happened to me that were not my fault, pre-addiction, during addiction, and work through that, but acknowledge when it is my fault, and acknowledge that it's now my responsibility. And yeah, like I've said a million times, and I will say it every time I say it, I work a 12-step program. I am part of Narcotics Anonymous. That works for me. It doesn't work for everyone. This is an inclusive platform, and I'm only able to share on my experience in this video. So I'm going to share my process of taking accountability and my process of self-forgiveness, which is tied into the NA process and the 12 steps. So whether or not you're part of the 12 steps, I think this is a useful way to look at it. And I'll speak on it in a more holistic view than actually a Narcotics Anonymous view per se. So it reflects on everyone. So let's begin. It's going to start raining. No. So what I'm going to discuss is the actionable change within my recovery and how I did take accountability. When we were in rehab, we had to write out our life story. I'm sure if you've been to rehab, you might have done something similar, writing a letter to your drug of choice, all that kind of stuff, okay? But I had to write out my life story, and what we would do is we would sit in a circle and we would read it to the people we were in the facility with. And that's when I started to become a little bit more honest than I had been in a long time, not completely honest, but I was happy to write about my traumas from pre-addiction and the traumas that occurred when I was in active addiction, but I struggled a lot to tackle the topics of when I had hurt other people and I had done harm, because I was very used to playing the victim my whole life. And I started to get honest when telling my life story. I spoke about the time I physically assaulted my mother to get to my drug of choice, how my brother had to physically restrain me, and I used my brother's physical restraint when I was trying to assault my mom as a way to say to my father, who was not living with my mom at the time, that my brother was abusing me at home, whereas he was actually trying to stop me from physically hurting my mom even further. And that I carried a lot of shame with that. Of course I did. Of course I did. And it was something very difficult and ugly to look at. And there were other things I had to look at: stealing from my own mother, stealing from my friends, lying, manipulating, just becoming a version of myself I never thought I could become, but I did, and I did quickly. I did a lot of awful things to a lot of people in active addiction. And it's funny because there were so many things I did that I didn't see as big. I didn't see as this big thing I had done. I had lots of friends, and I thought I didn't hurt them that much. I didn't steal from this one. I didn't lie to this one. And that plays into what happened down the line. But I digress. I started getting honest with this kind of stuff. And then when I left the facility, that's when the real work started. It was great to be sitting in a group of people, tell them the story without feeling judgment, listening to their stories without judging them. It felt there was a sense of relief around that. And that's the sense of community that's so important when it comes to looking at our past, when looking at accountability, wherever you find that community. When I left rehab, I went to a halfway house and I started going to Narcotics Anonymous meetings, and I went every single day for like a really long time. They say to do 90 meetings in 90 days. I did way more than that. But in that time, I got to know the 12-step program, which they did teach us about in the facility I was privileged enough to have gone to. But they gave me this workbook. And in this workbook, it starts with the steps and it takes you through these steps. And one of the steps was taking a fearless and honest moral inventory of ourselves. And that terrified me because that meant I had to write down what I had done to other people, what had been done to me, and say this to another human being in the form of a sponsor. Now, if you're not in Narcotics Anonymous, it's the same as just kind of journaling and telling another person what you have done and what you have gone through. And another person who you can trust and understand, be it a therapist, a friend, another recovering addict, whatever you find that in. For me, it was sitting down with a sponsor, someone I just met, and telling them my deepest, darkest secrets, things about myself that I was terrified of, that I felt shame about, and that I loathed about myself. From, putting my body on chat roulette like every single night, from hurting and physically assaulting my mother, from stealing from people. The list goes on and on and on. I did awful things. I took advantage of my auntie, whose daughter had just passed away, took over her house and turned it into my own personal trap house because she wasn't aware of anything that was going on. I did these things and I had to say this to another human being. And I did. And you know what response I got? Okay, how do you feel about that? Or, I did the same thing. And I was shocked by this. I was shocked by this because I felt like the world's worst human being. But all I got was someone who listened. I got a sounding board. I got someone who made me feel like what I had been through was something I could let go of because they had. That's the power of community for me, and that's the power of sharing and speaking about these things we have done that we hold on to. And that's just the tip of the iceberg of the stuff I felt a lot of guilt and a lot of shame around, just the tip of it. I'm going to stop that there because I'm going to make a joke that I shouldn't make. And it's going to involve chat roulette. Okay, I had to laugh and then I came back. Okay, so sharing with another human being and telling my story to another human being and having them just listen, share their experience, strength, and hope with me and relate to me and make me feel comfortable in that environment helped me let go of a lot. Or not necessarily let go of it, think, oh, it's okay to live with this and it's okay to live with this while sober. It also made me realize that a lot of my past trauma, I was trying so hard to numb with substance. I mean, it's not an excuse, but it's what got me there. I do think a large part of it got me there. And in the process of active addiction, I created even more trauma for myself, put myself in more situations that accumulated guilt, accumulated shame, started traumatizing other people, which made it harder and harder and harder for me to put down the substance. And that would create a cycle of trying to stop, going back, creating more trauma, making it harder and harder to stop. There's only so much numbing a person can take. And by saying my traumas and the traumatizing I had done to other people, to another human being, and having them just listen and accept it, helped me feel that I could get through this sober. And I never thought that was possible. I never thought that was possible. Whew. Emotions. So during this time in the Narcotics Anonymous program, that's step 4 and step 5, writing down the things I had done and sharing it with another human being. I carried on doing the program, carried on working the steps, went from meeting to meeting, and all I wanted to do was make amends as soon as possible. And my sponsor at the time said to me, you're not going to make amends right now. You have other work to do. You know what you've done. You know what your behaviors were, and you know what your character defects, if that's something you're okay with calling it, I'm okay with calling it that, what my bad behaviors are with and without drugs. You're aware of this, which means you're able to change it one day at a time and pick up on the bad behaviors you display throughout the day while you're sober and work on fixing them. It's going to take a lot of time to get to the process where you're actually able to make amends. And I started to realize that slowly through the process, I was even making silent amends with people. My mom started seeing a behavioral change in me that she had never seen before. She started seeing me committing to doing things, going to my meetings, staying sober, meeting her when I was supposed to meet her, kind of learning how to regulate my emotions. And she saw this change. And I think she needed to see that change a little bit before I could sit down with her and say, hey, Mom, I am sorry for what I did to you. Before I could sit down with a friend and say, hey man, I'm sorry for the time I tried to run you over. Before I could sit down with a friend and say, hey, sorry about that time, I stole money from you. It would take a while to get there. And I had to work on my own behavioral changes and my own thinking before I got to the point where I could confidently sit down with someone without other intentions. Like literally sit down with them to say sorry because I wanted to, not because I wanted something from them, not because I expected an apology from them. And it did get to that point eventually where I was able to sit down with my mother and apologize to her. And she's my mom. She says she forgives me. She just doesn't want me to go back. There's a lot of emotion. She doesn't want to talk about the horrible things I did to her because it's a trauma for her, and I have to respect that boundary. I have to sit down with my brother and say sorry. And when I did that, and I did sit down with my brother and I said sorry, he said, I don't want your sorries. I don't want your sorries. I want to see consistent behavioral change before we even get to that point. He was the first one who kind of shut me down like that quite quickly. And it's difficult to go through that when you're making amends and kind of trying to forgive yourself for your past when someone isn't exactly ready to forgive you just yet. So I had to build up to the point where I realized that that's fine. No one owes me forgiveness. The only person who owes me forgiveness is me. And I can't prove to my brother immediately that I'm a completely changed person and that's never going to happen again. I need to show him one day at a time through behavioral change that that's going to happen. And by implementing these behavioral changes every single day in my life, I was able to see that, hey, Tony, you're not the person you were in active addiction. If your brother isn't ready to forgive you just yet, you know you aren't that person. So why can't you forgive yourself? And that was a beautiful thing to realize. I remember getting to points in my recovery where I wanted to react negatively to something and I didn't. And I felt so proud of myself for not doing that. Or when I did act a certain way or act on a character defect that I didn't like, I was able to say to myself, hey, that wasn't cool. Go up to that person and apologize to them and change your behavior. And those were little wins for me. It's the little wins that matter when it comes to forgiving yourself, knowing that I'm not the same person I was back then, like really knowing that I'm not that person. So I didn't necessarily need my brother's full forgiveness at that time, and that was liberating. And then throughout like the first year of my recovery, I slowly started like speaking to family members again, making amends, financial amends. Taking my mother through how much money I stole from her was absolutely devastating. And we were lucky enough to have done that in rehab and kind of saying to her, I'm going to pay you back in time. I'm going to pay you back in time, which I have slowly, in time done that. But things like that, there's financial amends, there's emotional amends, there's just simply saying sorry. And there's also a lot of amends where you can't say sorry to the person, dude. You can't. It's either going to hurt them or hurt you. But there was one person in my story that I genuinely could not say sorry to. And that was a person who was like a mentor to me. And unfortunately, when I was in active addiction, I got a call from this person who I knew had mental health issues. And he said to me, can you please come over tonight? I need someone to talk to. And I was like, made up some excuse. I don't even remember what it was. And I just carried on using and partying and going on with what it is I was doing. And the next morning, I got a phone call from someone letting me know that this person had passed away. How do you make amends for that? How do you forgive yourself for that? That was something that was something I really struggled with and still struggle with to this day. And I put a lot of blame on myself for that. Like, what happens? Would he still be here if I had gone there that night? I don't know. I don't know, but he's not. He's not here. I was willing to do drugs over seeing a friend who needed my help, and I lost that friend, and the world lost that friend. And I have to live with that, and I have to forgive myself for that. And that was hard. That was really difficult, but the only way for me to continue on the path of recovery is to make sure that does not happen again. That I listen to people when they're in need, that I take the steps to be a present friend. And if I'm unable to be present, tell that person I am unable to be present, you know? I also had to do a lot of work on that, and I'm still doing a lot of work on that. And I know a lot of people, when I do share about that, tell me I'm a murderer, tell me that he would still be alive and not have taken his life if I had gone there that night. I don't know that. You can say that all you want. I don't know that. I don't know if I would have gone there and found him in that state. All I know is the world lost an amazing human being. And I could have possibly done something to help, but I didn't. I didn't because I would rather be doing crystal meth in a weird trap house while on chat roulette, you know? But I had to work through that. And I'm mumbling a bit because I want you to see the emotion and the thought process that goes into it, because I don't want to completely forgive myself for that, but I really have to in order to survive, in order to move forward. I don't know if you've had any similar experiences to that. Please leave a comment about yours so we can see that we're not alone in these kinds of feelings. We're really not, and that there is a way through it, you know. Uh, I'm going to take a 2-second break. So those are the heavy things we deal with in recovery that a lot of people who aren't addicts, or a lot of people who have never struggled with mental health or anything like that, don't necessarily understand. I used his passing as a reason to use more in my addiction not my addiction recovery. And I did the same thing for my cousin, and that seemed to be a pattern in my life, using the loss of other people as an excuse to create even more loss for other people. And those, for example, are people I can't get forgiveness from. I can't expect forgiveness from him. I have spoken with family members of his, and I have experienced forgiveness from them. But that's a very internal journey that we need to work through every single day, that I need to work through every single day. Sorry if I say we, I mean I need to stop. I'm very, very aware when I do that. I don't want to project onto anyone. This is just my story. Okay. There are also times in addiction recovery where you do not get any kind of forgiveness, and you have to be prepared for that. I'll tell you, the first time it happened to me was a year into my addiction recovery. And I sent a message to a friend of mine. And this goes back to when I said, sometimes you think you didn't really do harm to people. Like you think, oh, that person, I never stole from them, or I never did anything really bad to them. So they're a good person that I can say, hey, I'm sorry for everything I've done. There's already a motive in that already, which already says to me, hey, there's a reason you're saying sorry to this person, because you think they'll instantly forgive you. Anyway, so I did that. I sent this person a long Facebook message, and I apologized for, just for my active addiction, if I ever let them down when I was in active addiction and all that. This person sent me a message back and said, Tony, I'm sorry. I cannot forgive all the times you let me down, all the times you lied to me about where you were, all the times I tried to be there for you, thinking you were going to die, and you were just nowhere to be found. I had no idea of the impact I had put on this friend of mine and on this person up until that point. I thought it would be an easy amends. And that happens a lot. That happens a lot. And I had to sit with that when I got that response. I had to sit with that. And I phoned my sponsor at the time and I said, this is what happened. And she said to me, well, she doesn't forgive you. The only person who can forgive you is you. And it took me back to the experience I had with my brother, where I was like, well, there's nothing more I can do. I can say thank you to her for giving me the time, and I respect how she feels, and I wish her all the best. And I did that. And it was so hard to do that. But I did it, and I got through it. And I really never expected any kind of communication with this person at all for the rest of my life, And it was about 8 years into my recovery when I got a Facebook message from them, and they said, hey, I just want you to know I've been watching you from a distance. I've seen the change, and I am proud of you. And that showed me that that person had forgiven the past and seen the change and seen the behavioral change, which in time is what happened with my brother. He saw the behavioral change. And my brother and I had a really distant relationship for a large portion of obviously our lives, and especially when I was in active addiction and of my recovery, because he kept thinking I was going to relapse because of the experiences he had had previously with me. Like he found it really hard to trust me. But when my dad got really sick, that's when me and my brother came together. And when my dad had cancer, me and my brother spent every single day with our father and were able to be by his side. And in the process, became best friends, essentially. And I actually ended up moving next door to him for a really long time. He was my neighbor. And that kind of amends and that kind of forgiveness from his side came in time. But I was able to forgive myself before my brother forgave me because I saw my behavioral change and I knew that I was not the person he saw me as anymore. You know, it doesn't take away from the bad things I did. I just knew I would never do them again while I was sober. I knew I wouldn't. And that was how I was able to forgive myself for what I had done to my family. I was going through a really difficult time with my mom in my recovery because she struggles to say the word addiction. She struggles to say the word, to say crystal meth. She struggles to say my drug of choice by name. It like gives her PTSD. I can't talk about the things to this day that I really did to my mom too much or in too detail because this poor woman is going through serious PTSD. She doesn't want to go to Nar-Anon meetings. She doesn't want to go to Al-Anon meetings. She wants to deal with it on her own. And I thought I'd never be able to have like real honest discussions with her about it because she wasn't ready for it. And fair enough, like that's her process, that's her journey. But I had to forgive myself in that time. Even if she didn't want to talk it through, I needed to talk it through with someone else, which would be my sponsor, which would be at meetings, which would be in therapy if I was going through to therapy, which would be just with my group of friends. And that helped me forgive myself. But on my 10-year addiction, no, what my 10-year? On my 12-year, it was this year, my mom came with me to her first ever Narcotics Anonymous meeting and sat with me while I shared my 12-year birthday. And she was able to hear me tell those stories. She was able to hear me say my drug of choice by name. She was able to sit in a room full of addicts and see them hear my story without judgment. And I think real forgiveness from her happened that day. It was magnificent. It was magnificent. These things take time. Healing takes time. And forgiving ourselves is a process, and getting forgiven is a process. If we even get forgiven, if we even get forgiven, if we're even able to say sorry, if we're even able to prove our behavioral change. That aside, it's not about self-punishment, taking accountability. It's about moving through the guilt and through the shame. And that is something that I do every single day. But now we're going to talk about how this kind of self-awareness got a bit toxic for me. Because like I said in the beginning, for me, I thought self-awareness meant being self-critical. That's what I thought it was. And I thought I was so profound for having that thought for a really long time. And it got to a point where I was being way too hard on myself, dude, way too hard, taking accountability for everything. Like, it's wild. It's wild. We're going to talk about that now. The problem is, I became increasingly self-aware to the point of self-criticism consistently. And it became paralysis by analysis. Like, I would analyze every single thing from my past and in my present and very easily place blame on myself, tell myself I was playing the victim. I was scared to speak about anything I was going through because I thought I was directing the conversation to just be about me. Like I would be hyper aware of what I said and how I said it and analyze everything I did. And in the 12 steps, there's a thing called step 10 where you go over, you know, the way you were throughout the day. It's a daily inventory and you can see if you've done anything wrong and kind of work on fixing that behavior. I was always seeking something wrong I had done. And I would always look, I was just always analyzing and very self-critical and self-aware. And it kind of festered into looking at my past. For example, if you followed this page, you know that one day when I was in active addiction, I was with this is a trigger warning for SA. I was with my boyfriend at the time and I was using with him and he called me into a room with him and I thought we were doing drugs, which we were. Pulled out the drugs, but his friend was in the room with him and the door locked behind me and I was sexually assaulted before I got out of that room. And I went home straight away after that. I went to my mother's house after that. I still had drugs on me and I was still doing drugs, but I was devastated. And I have the journal entry of that night. I'm not going to read it now. That's for another video. And I was terrified of what had happened. And I said, I'm never going back. I'm going to go get the help I need. And what did I do? I went back. I went back. And that was a pattern. I kept going back, kept going back. And I blame myself a lot for the sexual assault. And at the end of the day, I'm going to say this to you and I want you to listen to me. I do not get a pass for the shitty things I did when I was in active addiction just because I was an addict. And the world's cruelties do not get a pass at me and my body just because I was an addict either. And it took me a very long time to realize that. And I want you to know that that's where a lot of figuring out, yes, I'm accountable for being with someone who was like that and going back. But I did not ask for that to happen. I was an addict. And in addiction, I lost a lot of choice. In recovery, I have that choice back. And in recovery, there's no way I'm ever going back to that, you know? That's where a lot of self-forgiveness comes in. And I want you guys to really listen to what I said then, because I wish someone had said that to me. Whew. And I had to work on that. I had to work on seeing my part in things, seeing what was my fault, what wasn't my fault, but what I was responsible for at the same time. And I was responsible with working through what I had been through that wasn't my fault up until this point. And that's tough. That's tough to digest. Things that happened to me when I was a kid were not my fault. They were never my fault. I'm responsible for my healing now and for my actions and behaviors around that, and not using them as excuses for everything, but rather using them as a way to understand my behaviors now, and work on changing those behaviors. That's where a lot of self-forgiveness comes in for me. And I really want you to take that to heart, Ooh, to get to the basics of how are we able to forgive ourselves for what we did and the people we hurt in active addiction. For me, it started with just acknowledging the things I did and the things I felt guilt and shame around, and the things I was scared to face, the things I was scared to actually take a honest look at and see my part in. And I was able to do that by writing it out and saying it to another human being. For me, that looked like writing it in my 12 steps, in step 4, and in step 5, saying it to another human being. For anyone, all it is about is just, if you're in NA or not, acknowledging those things and saying it to another human being, whether that's a friend you trust, whether it's another recovering addict, whether it's a family member, whether it's a member, if you're religious in your religious organization, just saying it out loud and realizing that after saying it, you didn't die. And that's how we can let go a lot of the guilt and the shame. And then comes the amends, and trying to make amends where possible, unless it can hurt someone else, making amends except where to do so could injure yourself or others. Figuring out who the people are that you want to talk to and you want to say sorry to, and figuring out who you're able to say sorry to, and also doing it without any expectation, without thinking this needs a result. I need to be forgiven as soon as I say this out loud, because there's many times for me I wasn't forgiven, and that's okay. Then the work really began, where I could look in the mirror and say, I know that that was my past. It does not make me who I am today. And I am able every single day, one day at a time, to not act on that past behavior, and in time show myself I'm not that person. I was sick when I was that person, and I won't be that person again. And if I do act out on a part of myself I don't like, I can acknowledge it and I can try and do better. That's why it's just for today, one day at a time, and I found that really helpful. And the process is slow and it's ongoing. Like I said, there's many times I'm way too hard on myself. And what I've got now is a group of people in my life who are able to say to me, hey, I think you're being too hard on yourself. And I can take a look at myself and say, you know what? Yes, I am. Yes, I am. And I can forgive myself for that and work through that. And the work starts by acknowledging, for me, the work started by acknowledging what I had done, acknowledging my guilt and shame, and building a life beyond my guilt and shame. For me, forgiving myself wasn't about dismissing my past. It's about building a new future one day at a time, and there's beauty in that. And I'm going to round this out by telling you what happened at my 10-year share. I was sitting in my 10-year share telling my story, and I told the story I told you in the beginning of what my counselor said to me. Tony, how does it feel having disrespected the memory of your dead cousin and using her death as an excuse to traumatize yourself and your family even further? And I told that story in that 10-year birthday share. And across the room from me was my counselor at the time, Nikki Munitz, and she looked at me after my share and she put up her hand, said, "Nikki, addict." And what she said to me is when my entire outlook on self-forgiveness changed. My share ended with how my father passed away, and that's when I turned my life around and found eating disorder recovery. And she looked at me and she said, "Tony, how does it feel living every day in the memory of your cousin, your friend that passed, and your father? Because that is what you're doing now." And that was the moment I really realized the change. It takes time. And it's magnificent when you're able to look in the mirror and go, you know what? I got through this just for today. Thank you for being here, homies. And I really love each and every one of you. And I hope you know that from the bottom of my heart. You have no idea what you mean to me. You allow me the space to say, hey, I'm being too hard on myself. Time to forgive. Or I'm not being hard enough on myself for this. Time to work on that. And I love you all. I love this community. I love recovery. And in the next few videos, I'm going to be organizing interviews because I want to give a lot more people in South Africa space to share their stories. So that's going to be exciting. And I look forward to sharing with you. And let me know what you think. Let me know your journey with self-forgiveness. I love you, and we do recover.